Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to get us started. We still have a few participants joining, but it looks like we've slowed down. So I'm going to go ahead and start moving us forward this morning. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Kylie Goslin. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Strong Communities. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, the partnership is a state advocacy and policy research organization dedicated to ending homelessness and expanding housing opportunity here in the state of Connecticut. We've been around for more than 20 years, and we're the backbone organization for Reaching Home, the statewide campaign to end homelessness, and Home Connecticut, Connecticut's affordable housing advocacy campaign. And for more than 15 years, we've been bringing together a diverse group of more than 200 nonprofit, legislative, and state partners through both of these efforts on a monthly and sometimes even weekly basis to advance collective legislative and policy goals. So, of course, over the last 9 months, our activity has looked different, as has yours, I'm sure. Both of these campaigns have shifted into rapid response mode as partners have come together virtually to review data, solve the complex problems, and align resources to keep our most vulnerable residents safe. And it's been really awe-inspiring to watch all of you do this. And as we know, there's a lot more that we still have to do. And so in the midst of this pandemic and amidst the national reckoning around racial injustice and systemic racism, one of our key allies in this campaign, the Affordable Housing Alliance of Connecticut, who most of you know had been around for decades, unfortunately closed their doors. And so not long before that, we had already begun the process of rethinking and reimagining our affordable housing campaign, Home Connecticut. And in conversations with so many of you as we embarked on that strategic planning process for Home Connecticut, we heard over and over again how much you value the AHA conference and how important it was to bring all of these partners together once a year to review our losses and victories and also to chart the path forward. And so we've attempted in this weird 2020 way to try to continue to provide the conference experience and make it free to all of you. So we hope with more than 30 different sessions and a great lineup of speakers that you're able to find a space and time to learn something new and even to offer some of your own insights. There's sessions on everything from low-income housing tax credit projects and the QAP, to COVID response, to planning and zoning, to land banking, affordable housing messaging and communications, municipal actions and segregation. There's a lot to take in. So I encourage you to check out the whole agenda, forward it to friends and colleagues. You can still sign up for sessions throughout the week as we move along, and I encourage you to sign up for anything that looks interesting to you. But moreover, we invite you to consider becoming a part of Home Connecticut as we rebuild the campaign to be more inclusive, engaging, data-driven, and results-oriented moving forward. I want to note too, at the end of each session, as part of our strategic planning process for Home Connecticut, you'll see a 5-minute survey pop up in your chat window. And we'd really like to get your feedback on the direction of affordable housing advocacy in Connecticut. I promise it's only 5 minutes. We've tried to keep it short and sweet to really gather some key information. And so please, if you would take time at least once during the course of the week to participate in that and forward it on to others in your universe of contacts who may also have insights to provide. And finally, I want to thank our amazing staff for pulling this together, especially our Deputy Director, Chelsea Ross. We did not use a conference planning service platform for this. We, and by we, I mean mostly Chelsea, did all of this in-house. So a big thanks to her, as well as our communications director, Charlie Shaddix, our IT extraordinaire, Don Branson, along with our Home Connecticut staff, Sean Gio and Kaylee Pratt. And of course, a big thanks to all the presenters and speakers who are sharing their time and expertise with you this week. So on that note too, since we're not using a platform, we're doing this ourselves. So please bear with us if you have technical difficulties. Feel free to throw any questions you have or issues in the chat window, and we'll do our best to work through those with you. Finally, I wanted to note that we have some financial supporters who have stepped forward to help make the conference happen this year, particularly our collaborating sponsor and key partner, the Connecticut Department of Housing, and first and foremost, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, our leading sponsor, along with the Melville Charitable Trust, are always our sponsor. Our supporting sponsors, Housing Enterprises, Inc. and Whittlesey, and all of the other session sponsors you see on the slide who will be supporting a variety of sessions throughout the week. So with that, and without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to a partner and friend who has been at the table these last 2 years, and especially these last 8 months, crafting new programs. She's been alongside of us, coming up with creative solutions to everything we've been going through, and being our biggest cheerleader throughout all this work. So with that, I'd like to introduce Connecticut's Housing Commissioner, Seila Mosquera-Bruno. Thanks for joining us, Seila.
Thank you, Kylie. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I kick off Tipping Point, Connecticut's Affordable Housing Conference, a week-long conference with great sessions and roundtable conversations that will inspire you, enlighten, and perhaps entertain you at times. I know virtual conferences can be challenging, but Kylie and her staff have worked hard to ensure that this time is worth your while. As you all know, Governor Lamont has been proactive in Connecticut's response to public health crisis and has supported the Department of Housing initiatives to assist our residents in these critical times. Let me give you a flavor of the housing activities undertaken under the Lamont administration. On the pandemic response, more than $70 million are being deployed for housing assistance and financial support to our nonprofit partners. From deconcentrating shelters, providing hotel rooms to our most vulnerable residents, providing rental assistance to more than 1,000 families and individuals to secure permanent housing, to temporary rents and mortgage assistance. In addition, more than $10 million in state investment are being used to renovate 12 shelters and provide needed repairs and the social distance that now is required. On the production side, the Department of Housing and Connecticut Housing Finance Authority currently have 4,200 units under construction, 175 million in state investment, and 740 million in other public and private funding, creating more than 2,250 jobs in construction and related industries. The department also allocated $560,000 to 43 towns to develop affordable housing plans. There was no playbook for the challenges of a pandemic, but since the very beginning, Governor Lamont has been front and center, literally and figuratively. You guys have seen him every day on briefings in the TV. He has inspired us to come up with creative ideas for quick responses. We could not have had a better leader to guide us through this uncharted territory. So I found a movie clip that can better illustrate what I mean.
We're working to queue up the video. One moment.
Our guy's 45 hours. That brings him to about there. Gentlemen, that's not acceptable. Gene, you gotta talk about power here. Whoa, guys!
Power is everything. Power is everything.
What do you mean?
Without it, they don't talk to us, they don't correct their trajectory, they don't turn the heat shield around. We gotta turn everything off. Now. They're not gonna make it to re-entry.
What do you mean, everything?
With everything on, the LEM draws 60 amps. At that rate, in 16 hours, the batteries are dead, not 45. And so's the crew. We gotta get them down to 12 amps.
12 amps? How many?
You can't run a vacuum cleaner on 12 amps, John. We gotta turn off. We have to turn off the radars, cabin heater, instrument displays, the guidance computer, the whole smack.
Whoa, guidance computer. What if they need to do another burn? Gene, they won't even know which way they're pointed.
The more time we talk down here, the more juice they waste up there. I've been looking at the data for the past hour.
That's the deal?
That's the deal.
Okay, John. The minute we finish the burn, we'll power down the limb.
All right.
Now, in the meantime, we're gonna have a frozen command module up there. In a couple days, we're gonna have to power it up using nothing but the re-entry batteries.
Yeah, we've been tried before.
Hell, we've never even simulated it before, Gene.
Well, we're gonna have to figure it out. I want people in our simulators, working re-entry scenarios. I want you guys to find every engineer who designed every switch, every circuit, every transistor, and every light bulb that's up there. Then I want you to talk to the guy in the assembly line who actually built the thing. Find out how to squeeze every amp out of both of these goddamn machines. I want this mark all the way back to Earth with time to spare. We never lost an American in space. We're sure as hell not gonna lose one on my watch. Failure is not an option.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce to you our Governor, Ned Lamont. Governor, are you there?
Governor Lamont, if you're on, you may be on mute. Okay, we unfortunately can't hear the governor. We will work on that in the meantime. I want to thank the commissioner for joining us today. Oh, I think he may be off mute. Governor, are you here?
Governor's unmuted. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can.
How did Seila do? Is she pretty good?
Yep.
He was great. Thank you.
I couldn't find a better movie to describe how I can see this administration going forward. And we all have to make sure that nobody stays behind.
Like, she's the best. We're so proud. She's leading housing, and what we've got to do is we ramp up our affordable housing. If we've learned one overwhelming message during this pandemic, which I can talk about in a minute, is you can't leave anybody behind. It's not just the right thing to do for that person, but it's the right thing to do for your community. If people are homeless, if people don't have access to health care, if they don't feel like they can get tested, that's a danger to themselves, and that's a danger to the whole community. And I think that phrase, "we're in it together," has a whole new meaning. Let me just back up for 1 minute, if I could, and tell you where we are in this pandemic, because I just got off with all the governors last night, and we're obviously moving into a new phase. But it's different than it was in April, May, and I'll tell you how. April, May, as you probably remember, was more regionalized. You saw that map on CNN. It was just a big red dot over the New York metro area that included southern Connecticut. And the rest of the country at that point was not that severely hit. Now, 8 months later, America is a red dot. And what that means in terms of Connecticut is not regional to southern Connecticut or the cities, but it has really been widely dispersed, and about 80% of our state is in a red zone. And what does that mean? That means, at least from the good news point of view, we are so much better prepared than we were 8 months ago. Back then, we could do maybe 100 tests a day. Now we're doing 20,000 tests a day. And we now have a track and trace system, which we can talk about, that allows us to focus and contain the virus a lot more effectively. You know, last time there was no national stockpile down in Washington. That was a bit of a joke. This time we have a 90-day supply of all the important things, including the masks, and so do our hospitals. And you always have to keep an eye on the nursing homes, but I think they are much better prepared as well going forward. So between greatly expanded testing, a lot more of the PPE that we need, great coordination with our regional governors, we're in a much stronger position. The risk is, I think, what I worry about now when I look at hospitalizations is people, and by which I mean doctors and nurses. In the old days, I could borrow from Hartford to make sure we had adequate supply of people, doctors and nurses in Stanford, and then vice versa. And we can't do that now. And I can't take anybody from any other states. So when I think about how we stay open and what it looks like, we are going to be watching capacity of our hospitals, less about beds, more about people than ever before. The other thing I think we have learned, and we learn every day, to be blunt, is that it's not like an on-off switch where we have to shut down. We're finding that back in April, we really had a shelter-in-place order. We're finding that, for example, retail establishments can stay open. We're worried about overcrowding there. They got to be really strict upon that, and obviously wearing the mask and the disinfecting. We're finding that schools, especially K through 8, have been able to open and stay open safely with a much lower infection rate than you have in the general population. And we've, look at Europe, for example, which has a very high infection rate, except in their schools, which they have kept open. So an example of how some things are going to be, different than they were 8 months ago. And finally, a lot of news about vaccines, and Moderna came out today to complement what's going on with Pfizer. Good news, but I do worry about people letting down the guard and singing happy days are here again, because it will take months before we get adequate supply of vaccine and the ability to get that widely distributed, including a focus on our underserved communities. And it's going to be complicated. I mean, we may find that the Pfizer vaccine works really well with one demographic, but not as well with another. And same with Moderna. And Pfizer has to be, 2 shots 3 weeks apart. Moderna has a different protocol. Some has to be stored at 100 degrees below zero. So you can see it's a monumental task to vaccinate 3.5 million people on a timely basis. And give people confidence that it's the right thing to do. It was ironic as heck, but just before COVID struck, we had 1,000 folks who said, you can't make me vaccinate my kid. I don't trust vaccines. I'd like to think that COVID is making people a little more confident about this, but we have to work on that at the community level as well. And I'll just leave you with that thought that we've got a complicated 2 or 3 months coming up. And I know how beleaguered everybody is, that we thought we were rounding the bend this summer when we had the lowest infection rate in the country. And now we're at 5%, which is, South Dakota's at 50%. So keep it in some perspective, but 5% is a lot. And it's a lot more than where we were a month ago. And it will probably get a little worse before it gets better. But if I can keep people focused, maintaining the discipline, in particular wearing the mask, keeping your Thanksgiving to a small group, a close family, I'd like to think by January, February, March, we're beginning to see the vaccines, at least beginning to get them distributed and giving people hope. And also by then we're on the backside of the flu season, which is a big plus. Let me just say to the Partnership for Strong Communities, look, I appreciate what you're doing for our communities. And the word community has a much broader meaning for me today than perhaps it even did a year ago. And I think I'm preaching to the choir here. And I need you, to continue to stand up. If you can complement our message when we talk about vaccines, when we talk about testing, when we talk about masking, doing all the things that we can keep people safe. And all of our communities will be stronger for it. I'd like to think sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much, Governor. We really, really appreciate both you and Commissioner Mosquera-Bruno for joining us today. We're so grateful for your time and for everything you've been doing to help keep Connecticut residents safe as we move forward. So with that, I would like to move on to today's keynote address with Dr. Tiffany Manuel, sponsored by Fairfield County's Community Foundation. Before we move on to that address, I just want to take a moment to offer some housekeeping items. For those of you joining us and familiar with Zoom, this is a webinar format. The session is being recorded, and we'll make all recordings available to conference attendees as soon as possible. All participants at this point have entered muted per Zoom webinar format, so please remain on mute unless you've been selected to be a host by somebody as part of this session. If you have a technology issue, as I've mentioned before, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send your issue in the chat. Just note that it's a tech support issue, and we'll do our best to assist you. Finally, at the conclusion of Dr. Manuel's presentation, if we have time for some question and answers, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A icon. So with that, again, I want to give a big thank you to the Fairfield County Community Foundation for sponsoring this. And I think for those of you who haven't already heard Dr. Manuel speak, you are in for a special treat. For those of you who have heard her speak before, I'm not surprised you're back for more. Dr. T, as she's known, is the president and CEO of TheCaseMade. TheCaseMade is an organization dedicated to helping leaders powerfully and intentionally make the case for systems change. She works with social change makers around the country to transform messaging and advance causes with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is a self-professed data wonk who is passionate about taking those findings and translating them into real action for her partners and clients. So we've been so lucky to have Dr. T working with us here in Connecticut recently. She's been working with the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity over the past 6 months. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, FCCHO is a regional partnership of the Partnership for Strong Communities, Supportive Housing Works, the Regional Planning Association, and the Fairfield County Community Foundation. And as part of her work with us, Dr. T hosted a series of focus groups in Fairfield County recently and is helping advance a new ways of thinking about messaging, not just the need, but also the benefits of expanding housing opportunity in our state's most expensive, segregated, and exclusive housing market. Her work has been transformative so far, to say the least. She originally hails from Detroit and holds doctorates and masters from UMass Boston, a master's from Purdue, and a bachelor's from the University of Chicago. She is a mom and all-around rock star, and it is such an honor to get to introduce her today. So welcome, Dr. T. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with y'all today. You know, this has been quite an interesting year for all of us, and so, you know, every time I have the opportunity to speak to a group of folks who are actively kind of out in communities trying to make the world a better place, but specifically trying to figure out how to get housing on the agenda of policymakers and of our neighbors and friends and family, it's a pleasure to talk to y'all about that. So I'm going to start. I'm actually going to share my screen, and let's see. Yeah. Let's see, let me just do one thing. I'm going to tweak it a little bit. All right. All right, so I'm going to start by just kind of introducing myself. For those of you who know me, you sort of know a little bit about my perspective. You know a lot about the kind of things I work on, but mostly I work on issues of how we build public will and sometimes political will to advance some of the issues of affordable housing and inclusive communities. And I'll just say, I mean, you just had, you know, a great address by your governor, which tells me that you've got some political will and momentum built at that level. That it's important for us to be pushing this conversation even beyond the folks who are already champions. So this conversation is about how do we get more champions, right, around some of these issues, not just for affordable housing, but for broader inclusive communities and what that looks like. And I'm going to be talking a lot about adaptive leadership in terms of how we begin to do that, and more specifically about this issue of strategic case making, which is, I think, a part of the conversation that we need to have. So I would say, as Kylie started off by saying, I've had a wonderful opportunity this year to really be working with some fantastic colleagues in Fairfield County who have been thinking together really specifically about how we advance issues of affordable housing. And so not only do I get to have a conversation with you at a very general level about how we make the case and build will around these issues, but specifically looking at some of the work that's come out of Connecticut. So there's a lot for us to talk about in terms of how we advance these issues. So I'm going to start by just talking about what I do, just generally speaking, and just kind of reinforcing the idea that building public and political will has to be part of the agenda for our organizations. I started my company mostly because I was watching a lot of folks in the housing space in particular, and a couple other spaces where there was some real potential. I think in housing, I think in climate change, and I think in probably the social determinants of health, there's some real momentum and real opportunities to advance better, healthier communities. And I started my company in part because I felt like we were missing the opportunity to really make a strong case for the solutions that we propose. And I'm not just talking about the small stuff. The stuff that we work on at TheCaseMade is the hard stuff. How do you get people to lean into deep, fundamental, transformational change to the housing system, right? Our housing system hasn't functioned well for a whole lot of people for a very long time. And we've been kicking that sort of can down the road for a very long time. And what I would say to you is that most folks on this call could probably rattle off at least 10 things that y'all could say would help us to advance, right? Better, broader, more inclusive communities. But one of the challenges is getting people to support what that looks like and to do the hard work. And so what I'm going to say to you all today is that if you really want people to embrace the hard stuff, the systems change work, if you want people to embrace equity, particularly issues of racial equity in this moment, if you want people to do that in a very inclusive way, then you got to have a specific focus on how to do that, on making that case very firmly. And so all of the work that I do with folks around the country, and we work everywhere. We work in the West Coast, we're in Chattanooga and DC and San Francisco. I mean, in all kinds of places, in Charlotte, all kinds of places all across the country, where the central focus is not just the policy issues and the kind of investments that we want to be made in our communities, but it's also how do we get champions around this work? How do we get people to lean in or lean forward on these issues, not because it's charity, right? Not because they think, they're sort of kicking and screaming and saying, oh, okay, well, we got to do something around housing. But how do you get people to lean forward because they're genuinely excited about the work that we're doing? And so if there's anything that I would say characterizes strategic case making, it's how do you get people to lean forward and to be excited about the work that you do? So I hope that's what y'all came here to get from me today, because if you didn't, it's going to be a long 40 minutes or so with me. But I think that's so necessary. So I'm going to talk about how we do that, and I'm going to use a lot of the work that we've done in Fairfield County as an example of some of the principles of what I would call strategic case making. So let me just start by just kind of grounding us in the moment that we're in. The governor did a great job of that. I'm gonna just sort of, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but I know we're all on the same page with the notion that our housing systems are facing probably some of the toughest challenges we've seen in more than a generation. And I would say probably many years ago, when I first started kind of in the housing space, specifically looking at housing policy, the biggest challenge was just how do we get more units? It was more about production. Like, how do we get more units of affordable housing, and how can we figure out the best deals and do the deals pencil out? And over the last probably 10 to 15 years, those issues have grown dramatically. It's not just about production, it's about preservation, it's about people's protection, and it's about how do we deal with issues of gentrification and displacement. It's a whole series of issues now that haven't been recent, but our awareness of these issues has grown dramatically, and our ability to try and address these kind of issues have come to the forefront. When you add COVID-19 and all the kind of stuff around that, in addition to sort of the racial protests that we saw this summer and all the other things happening right now in this moment, this is let's just take a breath and say this is a incredible moment to be doing this work. And it requires that you and I respond in a way that is bold enough, right, and transformational enough for the moment that we're in. So what I would say is, in this moment, how you and I respond is incredibly important in this moment. And I also want to say that, yes, the moment is big, but here's what I would say too. Let's not let the urgency of this moment make us solve the wrong problem. That's kind of a lot of what I sort of work with folks on, and the reason I sort of got into this work, because I saw many of us solving the wrong problem, right? What is the wrong problem? Well, there are a lot of them. There are lots of problems, so there are any number of them that we can solve. But some of them are things like solving. Some of us think we're solving this issue of public awareness, and the challenge with that, right, is that we think that if we could just kind of get our message out enough, if we could just yell loud enough, that people would be amenable to what we're talking about. If we could just get people to listen, if we could just have a platform, on the nightly news or something where people would talk about these issues, or if we could just get the stories of people who are experiencing homelessness or experiencing housing instability, if we could just get those stories out, right, then people would say, oh my gosh, we've been so silly. Why have we not been making better housing policy? Oh, right. In my day and age, many years ago, I went to get a PhD in my young, naive life, more than 25 years ago. I went to go get a PhD because I thought data was the problem. I thought that we just didn't have the right data to show policymakers. So I thought that if we had the data that would show, like when you invest in housing, when you invest in community development, when you invest in the power and capacity of people, right, no matter where their backgrounds or where they're from, when you invest in people, the return of that, there's both a financial return that we get back in society, but there's also a whole lot of social returns. People get healthier, kids get stronger, da, 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 da. Like you could rattle off all these great social things that happen. And I think, what I have certainly experienced over the last 30 years of my career, and probably many of you as well, that data really wasn't the problem, right? We've got lots of data. I mean, Raj Shetty, for example, right, out in Stanford, every other day is like putting out new data about how you can, at a zip code level, drill down and predict the future of what's happened to folks. And if you invest in people, like what happens 20 years later, we can predict based on where you live, like not only just your future earnings trajectory, but we can also predict things like your likelihood of having a chronic disease, right? We can predict that, right, with a fair amount of accuracy, right? So what's happened over that time is, I think for many of us, the recognition that this was never really a data problem. It wasn't. This was never really an evidence problem. This was never really a problem of public awareness. Who doesn't know that there are many communities across Connecticut right now where people experiencing deep, debilitating poverty and instability, right? This is not an awareness problem. And I just draw your attention to that. Let's not let the urgency of the moment draw us into solving some of those issues. In fact, the Stanford Social Innovation Review a couple of years ago put out a paper saying, stop raising awareness already, stop, because it's backfiring. They were talking about awareness campaigns as not only falling short, but actually backfiring. They actually do more harm than good in many of the ways that I'm going to talk about on this call. When we don't kind of lift up these issues in a way that allows folks to lean in a way that that expresses their aspirations for the future. So you may be asking me, well, Dr. T, if we're not having campaigns that raise public awareness, then what are we supposed to be doing? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Look at that. You asked. So what I want to do first is just talk just a little bit about kind of some of the things that we're up against, and then talk about what is actually a better way of trying to get people to lean forward on some of these issues. So what I'd say is, let's just acknowledge the headwinds. One of the headwinds is that we are in an incredible period of enormous political fragmentation and partisanship. And the work that we're doing in housing has always been a bipartisan issue, and there is a need for us to stay bipartisan, even though that is tough. It is necessary, right, for us to stay out of the politics of the moment, because it's not helpful for anybody, right? So just one part of the headwinds, which is that people are incredibly divided, and it's tough. So that anything you say, right, often gets woven through this sort of lens of, right, politics. And so it's tough, but necessary. The other thing I would say is, and I'm using some examples from Shelter Force magazine in my presentation today. I'm on the board of Shelter Force. So I read every article that we do. And they're often just real good nuggets, I think, for teaching. This one comes out of New Jersey, and it's an example of a headwind that I'm sure I've actually seen in some of and I've been lucky enough with some of my colleagues in Fairfield to give me examples of this in Fairfield as well, where we think we're doing something really helpful, thoughtful for community, but it gets read in the wrong way. And so what happens when people are not sure that they have a stake in your success, right? This is an example in Camden where the folks in community have been asking for affordable housing for a very long time. They were upset that the city had been working to advance what was happening at the waterfront and build up the waterfront. And it was beautiful. But they said, hey, what about what's happening in our communities? And so finally, when policymakers decided to advance several major developments of affordable housing, most of which that were going to be mixed income developments, folks reacted immediately. Like, y'all are not building this for us. We don't want that in our community. And so they started to protest. That forced policymakers into a position of saying, hey, wait a minute. Y'all have been complaining for, as long as we can remember, about us developing the neighborhoods and about us. And now, right, that we are investing significant dollars, you're still protesting, right? And so I think this is an issue of what happens when people are not sure that they have a stake in our success. That when we talk about housing in places and we're doing the deals and trying to figure out how to make those deals pencil out, right? How do we build in market rate and a little bit of, right, that folks will perceive that differently often than the way that it's offered. And so it's just a headwind that we have to navigate in this moment. Some of you know that I've also done a lot of work on narrative, right? This paper came out in 2016 when I was just starting some of the work in housing on narrative specifically. And I was just frustrated, right? And this first paper was about how just trying to get people to acknowledge that the way we were talking specifically about affordable housing as a thing was backfiring significantly. So when you say, hey, people need a more affordable housing in Connecticut, right? We have to build more, that people weren't saying, oh my gosh, how have we been so silly? We got to build more affordable housing. It was backfiring in ways that where people would say, hey, like for example, at the top of this, the mobility challenge, they would say, well, why can't you just move? Hey, Connecticut's an expensive state. You can't live in Connecticut, you got to move. There's South Carolina, that's cheaper. And so this narrative of mobility was overtaking our conversation about affordable housing. And there were many of them, right, that were overtaking our messages consistently. And so that first paper was really just an acknowledgement to say, hey, housers, like kind of listen up, folks. I know we think we're doing some great work by putting out kind of this conversation about who can afford and who is locked out of a housing market. But when we do that, it's not being received in the way in which we're giving that message. So I won't talk much about that here. If you want that, you can get that off my website at TheCaseMade. But that was kind of the first thing of saying, hey, listen, folks are saying you don't have to live here. Go down the road. And I would say, when I look at, Connecticut newspapers, at least, and I talk to my colleagues in Fairfield and other folks, you have a lot of that kind of mobility argument. Not everybody needs to live in Connecticut. And so why are they trying to live in my community? Can't you build that stuff, right, someplace else? So the last thing I would say, just in terms of just the headwinds, there are many headwinds, but I would say this is probably one that is really particularly challenging for us, is that folks most average everyday Americans don't think about housing systems until something is wrong, right? Until there's a problem, until we're in full crisis. And that's the wrong time to be trying to fix stuff, right? When you just have to get resources out the door. I think the governor was talking about that. Like, if we're in the moment of crisis, we're trying to figure out what to do. That's usually not the right time to be trying to fix systems, right? Mostly because you're in reactive mode. But that's the way that most of us, most people, right, get amped up about what needs to happen when they're standing in a line, right, trying to get unemployment insurance, and they realize that there's a bureaucracy that's been weaponized against them in terms of trying to get that, or they're trying to get food or whatever that is. And the same thing is true of housing. When there's a crisis, right, then people pay attention, and that's usually not the best time to be having these conversations. Be that as it may, here we are, right, once again in crisis, and so we're trying to solve some of these issues. So I want to divide the rest of my presentation in two parts. The first part is I want to just talk about what is adaptive leadership and how we get to that conversation, right? Because I want to say this moment in all of its glory does not need more crisis communications, right? There are a lot of communications on the call today. Y'all got that. Y'all can do that. But this moment really needs adaptive leadership. So I'm going to be talking to you all about the importance of us being adaptive leaders and how our communications, or how the way that we engage people, has to be from the vantage point of being kind of adaptive leaders. So that's one part of it. The second part is I'm going to be providing some very specific examples that come out of the work that we did in Fairfield around how you actually embody the characteristics of adaptive leadership, right, in the way that you communicate, and some really good examples that I think might be useful for folks in other parts of the state. So just a couple, I'm gonna tick off some really quick points. The single most important thing you can probably do right now in this moment of craziness is to really be adaptive. And when I say that, talking about what it is that Connecticut needs for the future is incredibly important. How it is that we are preparing ourselves for what we need down the road as we're adapting to the life that we have that is coming, not even the one for today. How do we adapt to the world that is coming is incredibly important. And I'll say a few things about that, specifically to define that. Adaptive leadership is usually balanced against this conversation around adaptive leadership versus technical kind of leadership. Most of us in the housing space are solving housing as a technical problem. So what does that mean? That means we got all the technical solutions. Maybe we need accessory dwellings. Maybe we need to lean into naturally occurring affordable housing and preserve it. Maybe we're talking about how we develop housing trust funds. Maybe it's talking about how we change zoning. Those are technical. That's solving a very technical problem because we know how to do that work. The challenge is when we lift up affordable housing as a technical issue, right, which is the way we normally talk about these issues, it's hard to get average everyday folks, even sometimes policymakers, to listen. And I put this up there because sometimes I play a little clip from Chris Hayes. He's on MSNBC. His father, some of you may know, was a community organizer and houser from the 70s and 80s. And he knows a lot about housing. But in this podcast that he did about a year ago, he talked a lot about why housing almost never makes the cable circuit. He's like, yeah, I know housing. My dad has done this stuff for a long time. I get it. But every time I hear housers talk about the stuff, it sounds like it's Fannie and there's Freddie and there's Liskin Enterprise and there's this and that, blah, blah, blah. It just sounds like it doesn't have anything to do with like us. Right? It doesn't sound like it has anything to do with average everyday people. It sounds like something for the experts to go and do something about. I don't know. And so he said, we don't really have many shows on cable news about housing. It's just, and the reason I want to share that with you is because at this moment, right, when housing is in full-fledged crisis, we've got millions of people, literally almost 30 million people at this moment could be evicted from their homes across the country, right? That is a national crisis. I think it's a national travesty. And to say that it's just not sexy enough, right, speaks volumes about why we have to change the way we engage folks, right? If they think of this as a technical problem, right, they don't, not only does it not show up in the national news, but people don't understand why we can't solve it, right? Because if housing is a technical problem, then right, get on your cell phone, right? Right now, you can order up a house right now, right, on Amazon.com. Right? You can literally on your phone, you can order this. And if you've got Amazon Prime, they'll ship it to you for free. Right? They'll even take a free return, right? And they've got many different varieties, right? They've got the solar model. I mean, there are all kinds of ways you can do that. Or people are watching that you can now 3D print a house for less than $4,000 in 24 hours. So as folks understand the technology is there, the technical solutions are there. People don't understand, what are y'all doing in Connecticut? Why can't you just solve this already? Why can't the governor or the council or anybody else, right, any of us, our housing departments, why can't you just call up Amazon, order up some and put them out there, right? This was an example in LA around the PodShare folks. They were talking about using PodShare. And so the PodShare to house the homeless. And this was a big deal. The city was really proud of kind of really having a real, this is a real opportunity to do something and engage this issue of homelessness in a really interesting and creative way. And they put this out, and almost immediately, right, what came the backfire, right? Folks saying, oh my God, you can't be putting people in pod shares when you wouldn't put your grandmother in this concrete jungle, and that's not. And I will say that's why this is an adaptive problem as well, not just a technical problem. The technical problem can be solved in a number of ways. There's right, all kinds of interesting solutions we could come up with. But if you don't bring people along, having them understand why this is an adaptive problem, an adaptive challenge for us to solve, and the context in which we're trying to solve it, and you don't bring folks along on that journey, when you get down to the solution, they don't understand, right, why this is the way we're solving this technical problem. And I would say that across the country, this is a large part of why my firm gets called in a lot. This is an example of what we did in DC, where we had the same issue. The regional commission, the Regional Council of Governments put out a report saying we're going to have some regional targets around affordability. We're going to do this and we're going to do that. And the response from the public in a place where housing is like Connecticut, very expensive, people said, oh my God, would you stop building? I'm tired of this. Every part of the city has a crane in it. Every little piece of greenery is getting like torn down to put some big multiplex something. And we're just sick of it, right? And that was a conversation, not just from people who had resources and money, but average everyday folks who could probably benefit, right, from some additional affordable housing, saying, we don't want this. We don't want more building. We don't want more, whatever it is, more affordable. We don't even care. Just stop the cranes, right? And so what I would say to you all, right, in Connecticut, if you don't lift up the sort of adaptive challenge that you're trying to solve for, your conversation, no matter what it is going to backfire. All those great technical housing plans you got, all those great technical solutions, all the 10,000 ways we can solve affordable housing or change the zoning laws, or all of that stuff backfires if you don't sort of raise this up as a technical issue, as an adaptive issue. I'm sorry. So here's an example of what I'm talking about, right? This came out of a Urban Land Institute report, and I thought it was a great example of how you can describe that adaptive challenge. They're saying, listen, affordability and urbanization are really two sides of the same coin. We all want to live in sustainable communities, but fostering a sustainable community requires that we create diverse housing options, because cities literally can't survive when we start to hollow out that diversity. So, right, that conversation is a very different way to think about this issue. Listen, folks, right, we all want to live in a great place, but if we're only building pricey condos, right, if we're only building housing that is one bedroom for single folks, or right, if we're only building one kind of thing, we start to hollow out that diversity. Or if housing becomes so expensive that average everyday families can't afford it, they have to move, and you start to hollow out the diversity. And literally our cities, right, across Connecticut cannot survive if you start to hollow that out, where only, right, one group of folks or two groups of folks, right, have a place to live. And so it's not just a matter of who needs affordable housing, it's what does the places where we live, what does our community need to survive and thrive? And I'm going to give you some examples of this language in the work that we did in Fairfield just in a second. So what I would first say is adaptive leadership really requires, right, that we help people visit the future. That future orientation is so important. Like, our cities in the future can't survive. That helps to help people get in the mindset of what we're trying to do and place the villain, if you will, right? The villain is the future that finds us unprepared. That's the thing that we're trying to solve for. When you do that and you put people's attention in the future, you get them, first of all, to be more optimistic about what that looks like, but you also get them dreaming forward, right? I often, when I think about this, I often say to people, just think about why we sell so many lottery tickets in this country. You ever think about that? Why are there so many lottery tickets sold in this country, right? Especially the ones like the Powerball, the Mega Ball, and all the other ones. Right. I mean, think about these little printed pieces of paper, and they have this little printed piece of paper. There's these little numbers on them. You may say, well, it's because people want to win the lottery. No, it's not just that, because most of us don't believe we're actually going to win the darn things. What that little piece of paper is, when people buy it, it's a ticket to the future, right? It's the idea. People start to dream. It gives them a day and a half, depending on when they buy the ticket. It gives them a day or a day and a half to dream about what the future could look like. Man, if I win that money, wow, what could I do? I mean, I could change the lives of my family. I could change. I mean, I could do, right? It's an opportunity for people to visit the future, and it's in that excitement. It's the energy of that pulls them forward. So what I'm going to say to you all on this call today is, as adaptive leaders in this moment where there's so much crisis, our best opportunity is to pull people forward, right, into a future, because the energy of that helps to propel them forward. So I'm gonna play a little clip of just to get you all in the spirit of that. I'm gonna play a little clip of Bill Gates many years ago playing that adaptive leadership role.
But you know, I think about this, and what about this internet thing? Do you know anything about that?
Sure.
What the hell is that exactly?
Well, it's become a place where people are publishing information.
Right.
So everybody can have their own homepage. Companies are there, the latest information. It's wild what's going on. You can send electronic mail to people. It is the big new thing.
Yeah, but you know, it's easy to criticize something you don't fully understand, which is my position here.
Go ahead.
But I can remember a couple of months ago, there was like a big breakthrough announcement that on the internet or on some computer deal, they were going to broadcast a baseball game. You could listen to a baseball game on your computer. And I just thought to myself, does radio ring a bell? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Right, so you think about that, the spirit of that was Bill Gates at the time. He was talking about it's crazy, this new thing called the internet. It's going to have all these big things. And all of us were looking at Bill Gates like, what are you talking about? The internet? Who needs the internet? What do you like? We have the telephone and we have, right? But he was saying, I need us to visit the future and trying to get us ready for that. And so I want to say that our responsibility in the housing space, right, change the notion of what you're trying to do. It's you trying to pull people forward into the future, not just because we actually want to get ready for that future, but because the energy of that feels different from saying, oh my God, the sky is falling in. This many people are poor. This many people are about to get evicted. The energy of that makes people want to lean forward, right? And gives folks, right, of thoughtfulness about what that could look like. And I will say the good news for us is there are all kinds of ways to get people excited about what that future is, right? All kinds of housing options. I mean, look at what's happening across the country in terms of housing, right? I mean, right, new models for housing, right? So I won't share much more than that, but what I'm saying is there's so many options for communities in Connecticut. Like there's so many things you can do. There's so many opportunities to create complete or holistic communities by thinking about what's missing in the middle, different types of housing we could create, thinking about different materials. This is a potentially adaptive reuse of shipping containers, right? Right. And when people first hear you're going to try to build shipping containers or use that as a material, right? They have negative viewpoints, but when you see what people are actually doing by adaptively reusing materials that we already have that would otherwise go to waste, and you show people what this could actually look like, they start thinking about what the possibilities are, right? Thinking about shared housing for these young folks, like these millennials who we want to stay in Connecticut, who may not be so interested in staying because the housing prices are so expensive. But when you think about what we could do to help create opportunities for our millennials to stay, maybe shared housing, folks, right? There are all kinds of opportunities of a mixed, right? Mixed use communities and what that could look like, or even just different ways of financing. Some folks are talking about tiny homes. On the left, this is a large church in Houston that's decided that it's going to help its members buy homes by creating these interesting financial models. So I don't know what the specifics are, what worked in your particular part of Connecticut, but what I'm saying is the energy of giving people what could be in the future and what's our opportunity in the future is a way to pull them forward. That's the adaptation. That's the adaptive leader. Listen, folks, we got to adapt to the world that's coming. We're going to need different kind of housing models. We're going to need different kind of financing. We're going to need different kinds of technology. We're going to have different orientations. We need different kinds of partners. That's a very different energy that you're creating when you start to be able to do that. Okay, I'm going to go through, I have a couple more points before I get to some of the specific kind of language stuff that we worked on in Fairfield. So I'm going to go through the rest relatively quickly and kind of skip some things because I want to make sure that I give some good amount of time for that. But I just feel like I want to make sure that y'all are not reading this simply as we got to change a couple words in how we talk, that you are embodying a different kind of leadership at this moment because you recognize what that does, right, for the folks that you're trying to engage. So number two, I would say, understand that our strengths as adaptive leaders is about collaboration and alignment of stakeholders. And so, if we really are going to do this well, we need to bring some new folks under the tent, which means that we can't just be talking about housing all the time. It means that we have to be very creative in how we create different kinds of partnerships and align other folks. And I will say to you that not everybody's going to come to the table. The kind of partners that you want are not necessarily going to be attracted to a housing message, right? So we have to get thoughtful about how we are developing a bigger message that then aligns larger stakeholders. So I always say that this quote by Warren Buffett is significant to me. It's not just about predicting the rain that counts, right? So it's not that you can predict the future of where housing, we need new models, we need new financing, et cetera. We can all sort of sit around the table and predict that. Your work in Connecticut is actually building the ark. You got to get the stuff done. And that requires thinking about who needs to be around the table and growing the table, right? Housing doesn't work if even one of those cogs in this kind of system is stuck, right? So your work and our work is balancing all the different folks who are in community and bringing in new stakeholders, right? I would say this is an example in Jersey where they've allowed their housing finance agency to actually pay hospitals, right, to build affordable housing. Because a lot of these hospitals have a balance sheet that's large enough to take on bigger developments, and they have a major interest, some of them, right, as anchor institutions in communities. That's the first of its kind in the nation. I'm sure Connecticut is working on first of its kind legislation and things as well. But the opportunity is who else, right? I want you all to be thinking in terms of this work, especially around this recovery effort that the governor was talking about. Who else needs housing right now? And I would say not who needs housing. Who else in Connecticut needs for there to be a strong housing system here in Connecticut? Who else, right? Whose business model, right, requires that people have decent housing? The healthcare folks, especially, right? Their business model requires that folks have decent places to live, right? Who else needs that? Our education folks, right, a whole range of folks in our communities. And so those are particular folks who can be our partners. So adaptive leaders, as we are, we're talking about it, understand that the intersections, housing and education, housing and health, housing and climate folks, housing and technology, housing and transportation, those intersections, right, are opportunities for us to bring partners forward, and that alignment matters. So as you're thinking about what you need to do, I want y'all to be creative. Who else besides us housers needs housing to work well and to operate better for across the state? So the third thing I will do is talk about data. I'm a data wonk by training. And I will say that often the way we use data is misguided. We think that just talking about data is enough to bring people forward. And I will say that it's not. And oftentimes the data that we're using backfires. So for example, here's one by the County Health Rankings, which just talks about housing. 1 in 10 families spends more than what they earn on housing costs. I'm sure I could pluck some things off many of your websites talking about how many families in different parts of Connecticut are spending more than what they earn or how housing costs burdened. And I will say that this kind of information and the presentation of this data backfires consistently, right? First of all, because when most folks see that, right, that's not necessarily a bad story there. 1 in 10, if you look at that, that means 9 in 10 families are doing okay, right? 9 in 10 are not, right? Don't fit into the category of what's wrong. It's that one little house, right? And so the thing, when people see that, they go, hey, listen, that's a success story. That means in America, 9 out of 10 families, right, are spending less than half of what they earn on housing. That's not a challenge, that right? They will spend that or share that as a success story. And there are lots of networks, we won't name them right now, but there are lots of networks who are spending this kind of stuff as a success story. But also, when you look at this, what it requires that you do is it requires that you think about, well, what's wrong with the little orange house or the little yellow house, right? What's wrong with them? Why can't they figure out what the other 9 houses have figured out? Why can't they get it right? What's wrong with them? Do they need financial literacy, right? Right? And so all I want to share here is that, and I could go on literally, but I won't. What I want to share here is we put information out like this because we think that it will pull people forward because they'll see the urgency of it. And this, what backfires consistently. Same thing on issues of racial equity, especially as they relate to housing. When you see things like this, the left side, an article in Fortune magazine, the right side, data that came out from Forbes, the same issues happen, right? When you look at this, it says Blacks and Latinos are going to be broke in a few decades. There's no wealth being created. We know that Housing is the #1 way that most Americans build wealth. And so being locked out of a housing market that is incredibly unkind at this moment means there's really very little opportunity to build wealth. And so they're going to be broke, right? So if this is a matter of public information, great. But if your goal in sharing something like this or sharing the information is to leverage people's public will to get them to do something about this, this is an absolute fail, right? Because what it says to me is, right, little yellow house, what's wrong with them? Why can't they figure out what the white families have figured out? Do they need financial literacy training? Do they not know how to manage their money? Do they not understand that owning a home is important? Are they not saving enough? Do they not understand what it means to save? Right. And so what was presented as information that might help you to do something, right? We would share it as saying there's something we need to do about this. What I'm saying to you is it backfires, because what it does is make you pinpoint what's not working well, and then make you think that what's wrong with those folks. So in addition, the question for us is, then how do we, especially at this moment when folks are distracted and they're polarized already, and then you put some data like that in front of them, people don't say, oh my gosh, how do we solve this problem? They go, hell, I got my own problems. I can't be right. I'm trying to. And so that's not what we want to happen. And yet our data, if we're not careful and thoughtful, tends to backfire in that way. Okay, I have one more thing I want to say, just as a general, before I get to some of the specific language. And this is important. This is the issues of equity. Like, as adaptive leaders, we just have to get to the moment where we're acknowledging equity and housing justice issues. Like I remember when I first started giving presentations on this, and I would talk to housers about talking about specifically racial equity. And they would be like, Dr. T, I know it's important, but it's just so hard. We're already struggling to get people to get their heads around affordable housing. And now you want us to talk about like racial issues and what like, and they would just like say, Dr. T, please, like, don't make us do that. What I would say to you is, yes, I'm saying that. And I'm saying it not only in terms of that, but I'm saying if we don't have that conversation about what's happening on racial equity, on economic issues of economic or housing justice, we're missing the moment to address those issues. And if we don't address those issues, we won't actually be able to arrive at this issue of housing justice. We won't be able to solve for it. So acknowledging that we have not always had a housing system that created parity, or at least that addressed some of these bigger issues, acknowledging that as part of your conversation is incredibly important, or you won't get the partnership that you need to actually move some of those housing policies. And so I don't need to go on to this. I will just remind folks, my good friend Richard Rothstein and other folks have talked a lot about the fact that our housing system was not created for the success of all those at heart, and it's created a whole series of disparities that are showing up, not just in health, but in a number of different contexts. And it specifically created a circumstance where, when you're trying to deal with some of these issues and you're trying to get the partnership, particularly of African Americans, for Latinx population, or folks who have not always been treated well in the housing market, or where there are deep connections to health disparities, man, it's tough. So here's the good news and the bad news for those of you who are for this issue of race. Housing is going to really test whether or not we're serious about this issue of racial justice. There's no stronger place where you can address issues of racial justice or economic justice than in housing. And so being able to acknowledge that in our work, this is the locus of that fight has to be in housing, right? Or it won't succeed, right? So really get that clearly, folks. If we in housing don't take up that issue, the folks who are really pushing for racial justice, they cannot get there, right, without a strong push on housing. They can't get there, right? You can push on police issues, you can push on education issues, but you will not get there without solving housing, because housing is really foundational to these other systems. So I won't say much more than that, but I just will say that acknowledging that is really important. And telling stories of, I would say, hope and interdependence in the context of that is what helps us to get there, right? Help talking about how we are actually dependent on each other, that housing, right, for people of color, that housing for low-income families is the only way, even if you're high income, that the region or that the state of Connecticut actually moves forward. That my housing stability is dependent on yours and yours is dependent on mine is the way that we begin to lift that up. The same way that we're now having this conversation in the health space, that my health is dependent on yours and yours is dependent on mine. Our fates are connected. And when you talk in those terms, you get folks to lean forward in a different way. And so adaptive leaders understand that you and I, right, we have to tell stories of interdependence, right, centering equity. It's not that those people out there, right, can't afford to buy homes. It's not that those people out there need to move. It's not that, right, it's that we're all connected, right? And if we understand those connections and we're highlighting those connections, we get people to lean forward and help us solve some of these issues. So I want to give, I want to just, for my last point here, number 5, just give some examples. What I would say is the bulk of the work that I do at TheCaseMade is around mastering the fine art of pulling people forward. Like, so how do you start to put in real time some of this language that pulls people forward? So, from my vantage point, some of you may have my book. It's on Amazon.com. I encourage you to get it because I want all of you to have it. But in the book, there are sort of 10 core principles of strategic case making. What does that mean? There are 10 core principles, social science-based principles for how you get people to lean forward when they might otherwise say, it's not that important, right? Housing, How do you get them excited about the stuff? How do you get them to embrace the work that y'all are trying to do? There are 10 core principles in that. And I want to give some examples out of a couple of these core principles as they're related to the Fairfield work that we did. So first, the sort of we and why. No matter what you do, the first thing in your communications and how you engage folks is connecting them to a bigger sense of we and a sense of why we need to be thoughtful about this issue of affordable housing. And what I would say to you about those issues is, many people talk about, telling your why. It's important that you get to the why. What they don't understand about case making is it's not just you telling your why I think we need to do X, Y, and Z. It's connecting your why to the why of the people you're talking to, right? And so this quote by John Steinbeck in East of Eden is really, I think, really encapsulates the thinking around this. If the story that you're telling, if the story that you're lifting up, or the narrative that you're sharing about housing is not about the person you're talking to, if it's not about their aspiration, it's not about the thing that they want most of all in their own lives, it doesn't have any lasting power, right? Even if you're talking about, all these folks in Connecticut and we can do so much for those, if it doesn't connect to how people see themselves, the folks you're talking to, it doesn't last. And so I give you this example, and I share this all the time, of like Nike, right? When you look at a Nike commercial, you almost never see a pair of sneakers in their commercials. Never. They don't do it. Why not? Right? If they're selling Nikes, and that's the shoes, and they're selling even a lot of their athletic gear, you almost never see it in their commercials or in their marketing. Well, why not? Right? Right, because Nike understands, right, and some of these larger international brands understand that the way to get you, the way to pull you forward, right, is not by telling you all about what they do and how they make their sneakers and what kind of leather they have and blah, 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 blah. The way to get you excited about their product and get you in a store to buy it is to put in front of you the aspiration for who you want to be. Right? When they put this stuff about fearlessness and they show you these folks doing fearless things, you don't even care about what the hell they're selling. You just want to go buy. I want that energy. Can you bottle it? I want that. I want to embody that thing that people just have when they're motivated and they're, right? It's the energy of that, right, that pulls you forward. And Nike has figured out, like many different brands, that they can sell a hell of a lot more sneakers to you by giving you the aspiration of who you want to be than telling you anything about their sneakers. And so the same thing is true for us as we think about issues of housing. Who are you talking to and what are the aspirations for their own experience? And so I will say that in the work that we did in Fairfield County, that's a lot of what we did, first of all, to try and figure out, we talk to folks in Fairfield County. We do these things called community voice sessions, where we listen to folks about what they want, right? So we do this exercise even at the very beginning where we ask folks, so what are things that are most important to you? And we want to we want to hear the aspirations that people are talking about. And very seldom do they talk about housing. Sometimes we would get a couple people who would say housing is really important, but mostly not. But they told us a whole series of things that really were important to them. They told us that they were concerned about diversity. They really valued diversity. Now, I don't think of Connecticut very generally as a particularly diverse place. I've shared this in some of my other webinars on the work in Connecticut, but it doesn't matter what I think. The point is that people in Fairfield County value this idea that Fairfield County is a diverse place and they want to protect that. There was a significant amount of concern about the fact that they are losing the diversity, right, that Fairfield County has. They also talked to us about health and well-being. They were concerned just from a health perspective, not even, and it wasn't even COVID-19 sort of just focused. It was a lot about having to work so hard that they missed having time with their families, talking about the stress of having to earn so much just to be able to maintain a decent space and, and community, that it was breaking their marriages, that it was breaking their relations with their kids. And they were concerned about that. I mean, literally, they talked with great passion about that. And they also a lot of concern about children's opportunity. They're concerned about their kids and their kids having a decent place to in the next society, right? So if you want to engage folks about housing, if you don't start there where their aspirations are and meet that aspiration, you will not get them to lean forward. So I will say, first of all, I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to work with some of the fantastic folks at Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity, and to be funded by Melville Trust, because I think this can be really powerful. And for those of you who don't have the report that came out of it, I know at FCCHO just put it out, and I'll make sure that I think there's a link that we can put in the chat so folks can get that. But let me just give you an example. So in the report, we gave a lot of conversation about why this conversation about these three things at the top are important: diversity and smart growth, health and well-being, and children's opportunity. Those are the things, right? That's the aspiration. Think about Nike. They put out what people want, and you attach that to housing. So we gave some sample language, right? The one on the right is about diversity, right? And folks talked about they were concerned they were losing it. So here's some sample language. You don't have to use this word for word, but here's an example of how you might embody that in your case making. You might say something like, Fairfield County is not only a great place to live, it's an incredibly diverse place to live. Anybody who's lived here for any length of time knows that we value living in a place that is welcoming, where people genuinely care for each other, where there's a sense of belonging. But if we don't act now to ensure that people from all walks of life can afford to live here, we won't be able to carry that diversity into Fairfield's future. That's why we're making smart investments in a diverse mix of housing options for people at all levels of income. That's why it's a priority. If we fail to make those investments now, other communities are going to reap the benefits of the diversity that we're losing. So in there, you got their sense of their own diversity, right? We leaned on that. This notion about being future focused. So remember that conversation about adaptive leadership and for the future, like we won't be able to carry diversity into our future, but also this notion of loss, right? That we're losing diversity, the diversity of our businesses, our small business folks are, right, we're losing some of that. We're losing the diversity of our people. We're losing the diversity of our housing stock. We're losing all of that. And who's going to reap the benefits of that? These other communities that are gaining because of what we're losing. When you put that in front of folks, right, what they are concerned about, and you attach it to this issue of housing, you get a hell of a lot more people who are willing to lean forward, right, because that's their aspiration, right, more so than you would if you put in front of them, this many people in Fairfield County are poor, and this many people in Fairfield County don't have, and this many people are, right. If I don't feel like those are my concerns, then I feel like, well, they should do something about that. It has nothing to do with me, right? And so we gave some examples too. Same thing about health and well-being and children's opportunity. The one on the left was one about health and well-being. More than ever, we know how important it is to prioritize our health and the health of those around us. When we invest our resources to make sure that people across Fairfield County are able to stay home and are safely distanced, it saves lives for all of us. And when we make sure that housing is affordable, it makes it easier for all of us to spend less time shuffling between jobs and more time with our loved ones, ultimately making us all healthier. Let's face it, life can be stressful, and we don't need to make it any more stressful for our neighbors, for our coworkers, our friends, our family members, by ignoring their struggles to find homes that they can afford. More affordable housing options gives us a chance to slow down and enjoy the health-giving opportunities that our community offers, right? So you're saying people told us they wanted more health and well-being, you're attaching that to health, and that's how you get them to pull forward. The last one was on this issue about children's opportunity. They talked a lot about their kids, and so listen to the sample language there. In Fairfield County, our children are fortunate to experience the diversity of the people, businesses, and environments here. When we invest in a diverse mix of housing options for people at all levels of income, our children get to continue to experience the diversity that prepares them for the future. When we plan for the economic growth that we need in Fairfield County with a strong eye on making housing more affordable, we get stronger, more diverse community that ensures that the next generation is prepared for the world they will inherit. If we fail to plan for the affordability of the homes that we need, we leave our children vulnerable and unprepared to join a future job market that will require the skills that only deep exposure to diverse people, circumstances, and environments can bring. Our children deserve the benefits that affordable housing offers, right? So you've turned that lens all around, right? That your kids actually benefit, our children benefit from that diversity. And that if we don't make sure they get that, right, we are handicapping them from a job market that's going to require that kind of exposure, right? You can't get that any other way than having a diverse group of folks, right? And diverse community. When you do it like that, people concerned about their own children's well-being in the future, and you attach that to the diversity that affordable housing can bring, you get people to lean forward, right? Think of the Nike example. What is it that people want? How is it related to affordable housing? You attach those two things together. That gets me to lean forward enough to listen. Okay, let me hear what you all have to say, right? And that's what you're trying to do, is you try to make the case for affordable housing. So adaptive leaders, right, as you all are, right, we're talking through that, start with a strong story about who we are. We in Fairfield County, we in Connecticut, this is who we are, right? And then play to our aspirations. We know that we want our kids to be strong and well prepared for the future. Affordable housing is what allows us to make that happen. When you tell that story, man, you get people who lean forward because they're excited about what you are talking about. And it gives you the space to then have a conversation about real substantive solutions. That's where you want to go. I think I'll do one more, just in the interest of time, I'll do one more example from the Fairfield County work, and then I'll encourage you all to download the full report, which has some of that there. So I'll say one of the other core principles is navigating some of the dominant narratives. The dominant narratives are the stories that we tell about all these kinds of issues. The dominant narratives could be issues about things like, maybe, but the dominant narrative may be individual responsibility, right? And we build up this notion of individual responsibility over time by retelling stories of that really focus on why people should be solving their own issues. In housing, I would say one of the dominant narratives overall is this notion that housing is a commodity, that your housing is about you making money, right? Versus, right, the place that shapes the future of our communities and our children. So I will say that, let's skip that. In the Fairfield County work, we wanted to undermine or unseat that dominant narrative. And so there was a do and don't. The notion was, the framing was around the way that people in Fairfield County, we talked to folks about, why housing wasn't at the top of their priority list. They told us, they started, literally, you could see people like going through this list of things in their heads. They were like, well, we're in Fairfield County. Fairfield County is close to New York. And we have great schools. And they were literally like tallying up, and we have great parks and da, 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 da. And so when they got down to the end of the tally, they'd say, yeah, I guess it would be expensive. Yeah, it's expensive. So they were rationalizing how expensive, right, housing is in Fairfield County by going through an itemized list, the same way you would do if you were in a grocery store and you were putting on the pricier items. You got organic, vegetables, and you got that pricey piece of stop sirloin. If you're going to put those kind of things in a basket, when you get the bill at the end, you go, yeah, that's how much it costs. So you got to get people, you got to address that. Otherwise, it undermines the ability to get folks to lean in on housing. And so in Fairfield County, we gave some messaging that looks like this. One, on the left side, why it matters, right? Because you don't want people to rationalize high costs. You want to get in front of it. So here's some sample language. Look, in many parts of the nation, Communities are struggling to balance economic growth with maintaining the quality of life for all residents. In Fairfield County, that's not our problem. We know that we can have the best of both worlds. We can hop on the train to New York for work and take a Sunday stroll in Central Park and come home to an amazing place that values diversity, that expands opportunity for people at all incomes, that makes it possible for our kids to go to great schools. We won't be pushed into choosing economic growth policies that exclude those, right, who can't afford luxury condos. Fairfield is a place where we demand balance, a great place to live, a great place to work, and a great place to play. So in other words, you want to get in front of that. This is not just about housing as, right, the itemized commodity list, right? It's that we can do both. We can have a great place to live, and we can make sure that lots of folks have a great opportunity to be in our communities. So I have a lot more to share just on that part, and I probably spent too much time on the upfront part. But I'll say in the full report, we go through at least 13 very specific kind of recommendation, both do's and don'ts, right? Don't assume, right, that that your conversation is going to negate all the negative framing that they've heard. You have to powerfully tell stories that get around or navigate some of those bigger issues. And we give lots of language for being able to do that. So I think I want to leave some time for questions. I have lots of examples in the, maybe I'll do this one thing. Kylie, maybe I'll do just one more because this one on equity is important. So making sure that you're addressing equity as part of your work. So in the Fairfield County work, we specifically said you gotta center equity as part of the conversation. Do not leave that out. Every conversation you want to center equity, and there's specific ways to do that. So this is some sample language for how you might counter that. Listen, years from now, the next generation of Fairfield residents, they're going to judge us by the legacy that we've left them. We don't plan to take old exclusionary housing policies that undermine the success of people of color into the future, right? So that's that future orientation, right? Those policies left intergenerational poverty as a legacy that we cannot afford to ignore anymore. It's unfair, it's unjust, and it's actually costly to exclude people from the benefits of safe homes and thriving communities. Our work to improve housing options in Fairfield is an intentional effort to envision a different, more equitable way forward. And we are actively working to dismantle the unjust systems that have kept many people in an unnecessary and costly cycle of hardship, right? So what I would say to you all is that was the last one, but I just want to make sure you got to get equity in that conversation for all the reasons we talked about before. Otherwise, you won't get the partnership that you need. And so I would just encourage you all that if you want to get more of those very specific kind of how do you take those principles right into a conversation where Fairfield and where some of the Connecticut data kind of shows up and they're good kind of samples, then you want to make sure to download that report. So I'm going to stop sharing and hopefully there are lots of questions in the chat or otherwise, and let's talk some of that through.
Thank you so much, Dr. T. That was great. We do have one question in the chat right now, but I just want to remind folks who are listening to use the Q&A chat icon in the bottom of your screen. You can type any questions there, and I'll be scrolling through them, and I'll toss them to Dr. T as we move along. So if you have them, again, use that Q&A, not the chat window, for the questions. So the first question we had is from Claudia Riley. She asked, can you help us counter the argument that diverse/low-income communities bring undesired elements such as crime? Folks that live in very homogeneous communities really dig in on this, saying, I moved to my town to get away from that.
Mm-hmm. So yes, so I think that's right. So there are two things I would say about that. That would be what I consider to be a dominant narrative, right? The narrative that affordable housing is somehow linked to crime is people have a lock on that. And when they get that lock, it's really hard to unseat that. So here's what I would say as a strategy. Number one, recognize you are not going to talk anybody out of that. And it's foolhardy to think you are, right? There's some narratives that are they're so powerful, even if they're not true. We know that's not true. They're so dominant in terms of what they are that, and there's a kind of, right, in our thinking, those are locked together. You can talk to people till you're blue in the face. You can give all the evidence you want. Well, this study suggests that that's not true, and this study said that. And we got dozens of studies that say that that relationship doesn't exist. But in people's minds, it does. So first lesson or first opportunity, do not try to talk somebody out of that stuff. When you do, you end up in, what happens is you end up in a rabbit hole arguing with somebody about crime. And you're like, wait a minute, I'm trying to talk about affordable housing, and all of a sudden I got in this conversation about crime, which is not even my thing, right? But not even the thing I'm trying to say. So there are two ways to get around those dominant narratives. One is to learn to do a pivot. And in my book, I talk about that. So for those of you who don't have the book, go on Amazon, go once you get it. There are a whole series of pivots, like how you actually pivot. If you've ever watched Kellyanne Conway on Fox News or one of the CNN shows, she is like the master of the pivot. Like what pivot means is take something that and about what the person has just said that you can agree with, take it, and then get back to your narrative. So if you were somebody who was talking about crime, you would say, you know what? Yes, I absolutely agree that we have to be thinking specifically about the safety and well-being of our communities. And that's why I'm so interested in affordable housing, because that makes sure that millions of folks who are not in safe condition, right? And you go right into that thing. And they may go back to that. You take it, you pivot, and you go right back to your frame and refuse to engage on that issue, because if you do, it takes you down a separate pathway. Now, so that's one. So one strategy is the pivot, right? If people are, if you know that the second thing is the third thing. The third thing is if you know that people are going to go there consistently, reframe that completely, that conversation. Make this about the conversation about what we value. Make it about the aspirations of what our folks are telling us versus that, and get back to stronger ground. So I know that's to some people that will be a very unsatisfactory answer, because you kind of want to go and you want to fight on the basis of just what's not true. But, think about the election that we just had. We just had an election where, like, all kind of alternative facts were, I mean, like, you're never going to fight, like, you're never going to dismantle that. Your job is to stay focused on what the framing and narrative is that moves us forward, and pull the folks forward who are persuadable, the bystanders who are willing to come forward on that issue, not try to fight against the folks who are going to kind of, who are going to get stuck in there. So somebody asked the name of the book. It's Strategic Case Making. Strategic Case Making. And actually, you can get off my website. I'll put my website link in there too. But that gives you some of those pivots, like, literally how to do an effective pivot. And sometimes when I work with different groups, in fact, in a couple of weeks, I think it's maybe if Christy's on the phone, she can, or on the line, she can give I forget the date of it, December 3rd or 2nd, or we're going to have a 2-hour session going through some of that. What are the negative disruptors and the dominant narratives, and practice together how we pivot so that it's so seamless. You don't even realize like that, right? Folks don't even realize that you made that transition. Anyway.
Thanks. That was great. I think we have time for one more question. Quickly, we'll squeeze it in before we go. Last question. Please share examples of successes where you found your work has moved the needle in new policy and development successes. So maybe they're specific to housing, but maybe not. So again, places where this type of narrative change has actually moved the needle in new policy or development.
Yeah, so I work in a number of different places across the country. And first of all, I want to say that every single place is different. So when I talked about the aspirations of your community, like the reason why we did that, like very detailed work in Fairfield, was because if you want to talk to Fairfield folks, you got to know what their aspirations are. And that the aspirations of folks in Fairfield is different from folks in San Francisco, different from folks in Chattanooga. And right. So every community, I would say, is different. And you got to be thinking about what that means for your folks. Now, maybe that the folks in Fairfield County may represent, right, folks across Connecticut. I don't know. You all have to, right, you all tell me that. But that being thoughtful about who you're talking to is important. So in every community, it's listening for that, kind of what that looks like. So we've been working in a very thoughtful way over the last year with the statewide coalition in Massachusetts, and made a number of gains working with that. Like we have a once a month call together. We call the Making the Case call, where communities all across the state get on the call and talk about the case they're trying to make for what's happening there. And that has been so successful. We call that like our kind of community of practice, where they can get on the call and just share kind of what's happening, and we can sort of group coach all at the same time. And there are a lot, just wins on top of wins across the state. You can see a lot of them in the Boston area, particularly talking about things they've been able to win that other states, right, are struggling to get to. One of my sort of best group of folks is in Newton. It's an initiative called Yes to Newton, or Yes to Newton's Future, right? again, what very future focused was in a series of fights around development issues because folks in Newton didn't want to embrace affordable housing as an issue. And we're just pushing back on that. And we're really well financed. And we've completely changed the narrative on that and got people to get really excited about like what it would mean to have. In fact, one of the best things, I wish I had a little tape of it. One of the things we did was have some of the kids in the neighborhood do a video where they were welcoming new kids to the community. And we asked the kids to say, what would you want to show the new kids that are going to be here from the new development? And oh my God, it was the best thing ever. The kids were like, well, what I want, welcome to the neighborhood. We're so excited you're coming. And I want to show you this. And if you come from a community where you didn't have like a lake, here's the lake and like, when you see that, the kids like enthusiasm and aspiration, right? You can't help but like warm who you are as a parent to some of these development issues. So all that I would say to that is that every community is different. You got to understand the aspirations of folks. You got to be creative, but there's lots of opportunity to engage folks differently to get them excited about this in a completely different way than I think what we have been able to do it in the past.
That's great. We got to take some of that and import it here. So we just need more Dr. T. That's the answer to all problems. Thank you so much. We so appreciate you joining us today. This was really, really helpful. I'd encourage everyone to check out the FCCHO session on the 2nd. Christy Stewart, who's the director of FCCHO, put the link in the chat. And there's also a poll that popped up on your screen that has some questions about session feedback. And then as you close out, we're also focusing, as I mentioned earlier, on creating a bigger, more inclusive home Connecticut, really thinking about that table and where we're going with our statewide affordable housing campaign. So you'll see another survey pop up at the end of this. So I really would ask all of you who've taken the time to listen to all of the great messaging that you just heard to participate in that. We really need your feedback. So thank you again, Dr. Manuel, for joining us today. Thank you all of you for helping us to kick off this conference. We hope to see you at future sessions. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.